the Ottoman coffee habit that almost got everyone arrested. A cup too far. You might imagine that coffee arrived in Europe as a smooth wave of warm, caffeinated enlightenment, that one day, the sleepy continent simply woke up, quite literally, with the discovery of this dark, energizing drink. But before it fueled enlightenment salons and sleepy scholars, coffee brewed a very different kind of storm in the dusty, sun-beaten alleys of the Ottoman Empire. Let's set the stage. It's the 16th century. The city of Constantinople, already a jewel of trade and empire, was bustling with activity. The streets echoed with the clatter of horses, the shuffle of slippers on stone, the call to prayer rising 5 times a day over the terracotta rooftops. And slowly, from the Arabian Peninsula, came the aroma of something new, something bitter, something perhaps dangerously stimulating. Coffee. It had already been bubbling through Yemen and the Sufi monasteries of the Arabian world. The Sufis, spiritual seekers and poets, used coffee to stay awake during their long, contemplative night vigils. In a way, coffee began its global journey as a sacred drink, a liquid aid to spiritual endurance. But it didn't stay cloistered for long. Merchants brought it northward, first into Cairo and Mecca, and then inevitably to the heart of Ottoman power, Constantinople. What happened next was not quite the tidy success story you might expect. In Constantinople, coffee houses began to sprout like weeds. By the mid-1500s, the first coffee house opened in the Tahtakali district, close to the commercial center of the city. It wasn't grand, just a few wooden benches, a fire pit, and kettles, but it was revolutionary. Why? Because in a coffee house, you didn't just sit and drink, you talked. And in a city where the flow of information was tightly watched, talking freely about politics, society, religion was not always encouraged. In the Ottoman court, coffee was first welcomed. Sultan Selim II enjoyed it, his court enjoyed it, and his concubines reportedly passed slow afternoons sipping it in their lavish pavilions. But the government soon realized something unnerving. Coffee houses weren't just serving drinks, they were breeding thought. These were not rowdy taverns filled with the smell of beer and the sound of song. They were, paradoxically, much quieter places. People leaned in, whispered ideas, debated news. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, mixing fact and fiction until even the humblest shoemaker began to feel, somehow, informed, and the authorities hated it. Several times throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman sultans attempted to ban coffee outright. Sultan Murad IV, in particular, took a famously harsh stance. His reign from 1623 to 1640 was marked by anxiety about moral decline and political unrest, and he blamed coffee for much of it. Murad IV believed coffee led to idleness, disobedience, and un-Islamic behavior. He associated the coffee house with sedition, and so he issued bans. But the bans were not mild decrees. According to some sources, which blend fact with a fair bit of folklore, Murad IV disguised himself and wandered the streets at night looking for anyone sipping the forbidden brew. If he found them, punishment was swift, sometimes even fatal. You may wonder, was it really about coffee? Not quite. The real threat wasn't the drink, it was the community, the unregulated gathering, the sharing of unsanctioned thought. But the bans didn't really work. Even with harsh enforcement, people found ways around the restrictions. Coffee was hidden in bowls of soup. It was drunk in private homes or disguised as other beverages. Some coffee houses went underground, quite literally. A few were set up in basements with secret entrances and whispered passwords. In a strange way, the more the sultans tried to suppress coffee, the more subversive and popular it became. There's something oddly human in that, isn't there? Despite the danger, people clung to their daily cups. Why? Was it the taste, the warmth, the energy? Or was it something deeper, a small ritual that gave a sense of control, community, and comfort in a tightly ruled world? By the late 17th century, coffee was too widespread to fully suppress. Bans faded, enforcement slackened, and the drink was, at last, quietly accepted. But that uneasy relationship between caffeine and control never quite went away. As you sip your own evening drink, maybe not coffee at this hour, you might reflect on how strange it is that something as ordinary as a cup of coffee once led to arrests, secret societies, and royal crackdowns. And you might wonder, what was really brewing in those early coffee houses? Was it just coffee, or was it the beginning of something larger, something stronger, perhaps even revolutionary? Beneath the steam, coffee houses as engines of the everyday. As you descend deeper into the story of coffee in the Ottoman world, you begin to notice something odd. For something so ordinary, so unassuming, coffee left behind a surprising trail of trouble. But that's only if you look at it from above, from the throne of the Sultan or the ledgers of his ministers. If you stoop down, if you sit at a chipped wooden table in the corner of a smoky Tatakale coffee house, you'll see something else entirely. Let's sit there for a moment, shall we? It's early morning. The streets are already noisy, but inside the coffee house it's dim and cool. There are lamps, little oil dishes flickering in wall niches, and the smell in the air is rich. Roasted beans, damp wool, smoke, and cardamom. The patrons sit on low cushions or carved benches. No one is in a hurry. You hear dice rattling. You hear the steady thump of a backgammon game. You hear stories. That was the hidden pulse of the Ottoman coffee house. Not just the drink, but the stories. In the 17th century, the coffee house became the poor man's court, his reading room, his parliament. For a small coin, you could spend hours here even if you didn't order much. Illiterate men came not just to listen but to learn about the markets, about city politics, about rumors of war or floods or famines. The coffee house was, in every real sense, a platform, and it frightened the elite, not because people were sipping espresso shots and writing revolutionary manifestos. No, because the coffee house was a loophole in the system. You see, in the Ottoman Empire, official information flowed from the top. Decrees were read aloud in mosques. Court poets shaped how the Sultan should be remembered. There was no free press, no printed pamphlets or street bulletins. And yet, inside the coffee house, gossip traveled faster than a royal courier. Take, for instance, the curious profession of the meta, the public storyteller. These were men who would stand in the corner of the coffee house and spin tales, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic, often deeply political in ways that flew under the radar. Using voices, props, and exaggeration, the meta was part actor, part historian, part trickster. He told stories about ancient kings and clever peasants, always hinting at modern parallels. The Sultan might forbid political commentary, but he couldn't forbid fiction, especially when it came wrapped in allegory. And so the coffee house became a public theater. And not only that, it became too an informal university. Here you might meet a spice seller, an apprentice calligrapher, and a retired janissary, all arguing about a rumor they heard at the docks. One might share a proverb, another, a travel tale, the third, a bitter recollection of military campaigns in Hungary. They didn't always agree, but the point was they spoke. The act of speaking freely, even if not fully free, was its own quiet revolution. Even religious scholars, or ulama, were split on the coffee issue. Some argued that it was an intoxicant and therefore forbidden. Others saw its social use as threatening to Islamic morality. Still others thought the fuss was overblown. It became a legal gray area, sometimes tolerated, sometimes restricted. But what really mattered was that, by the late 1600s, coffee houses were deeply embedded in urban Ottoman life, and they were multiplying. By the early 18th century, Istanbul alone had hundreds of them. Each neighborhood had its own, catering to its own social group. Some were rough, haunts for janissaries and smugglers. Others were elegant, frequented by poets and scholars. Some served only coffee and water. Others offered nargileh, hookah, or sweet cakes. The layouts varied. Some had courtyards, others mezzanines. Some were little more than converted stables, but they all shared one thing. The coffee house was never just about coffee. It was about time. In an era where leisure was rare and expensive, the coffee house democratized idleness. It gave ordinary people the right to linger, to delay, to think. And in a society that measured a man's worth by how well he obeyed, that was quietly subversive. The coffee house also reshaped commerce. Coffee traders became some of the wealthiest merchants in the empire. Port cities like Mocha in Yemen, Alexandria, and Smyrna thrived. Boats brought beans up from Africa and Arabia to the Ottoman heartlands, where they were roasted and ground in massive communal mills. Specialized cups and sezvis, long-handled pots, were crafted. Cup makers, bean roasters, spice blenders, entire economies rose around this bitter black drink. And as demand grew, so too did the customs network that supported it. Tariffs were levied, bribes exchanged, spies were sent into merchant guilds to check for political ferment. At times it seemed as though coffee was both the bloodstream of the city and a possible poison. What's more, the coffee house spread, quietly, inexorably, beyond Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, Belgrade, even Sarajevo. In each city, it took on the flavor of the local culture. In some places, musical performances accompanied the storytelling. In others, debates were common. And in some provincial towns, the coffee house replaced the mosque as the main gathering place for the elderly. Of course, the state continued to watch with a nervous eye, but by now, the drink had traveled beyond control, and by the time European merchants and diplomats took note of this habit, it was already deeply embedded in Ottoman life. They brought it back to London, Paris, and Vienna, and in doing so, they often ignored the long and complex politics that had brewed behind it. Europe inherited the drink, but not the struggle. As for the Ottomans themselves, the coffee house slowly lost its sense of danger. By the 19th century, it was still present, but no longer feared. It became routine, a little sadder, less poetic, but perhaps that's the fate of all revolutions in the end. Still, a question remains. If coffee houses helped shape thought in the Ottoman Empire, through whispers, stories, and shared idleness. What kinds of revolutions might have begun there, only to vanish beneath the steam? From forbidden brew to imperial routine, by the early 18th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached a peculiar state of coexistence with coffee. What had once been whispered about in back alleys and policed by sword-bearing sultans had become, well, ordinary. So ordinary, in fact, that to walk the streets of Istanbul and not smell the slow roast of Arabica was almost unthinkable. And yet, like so many things in history, the fact that coffee became ordinary didn't mean it lost its power. It simply changed shape. To understand how, we need to look at who was drinking it and how. Let's start at the top. Within the Ottoman palace, coffee became ritualized. The sultans, though initially wary of the drink's disruptive potential, eventually embraced it on their own terms. A special group of servants, the Kavasibashu, or chief coffee makers, were appointed in the court. Their job, to prepare coffee according to the strict etiquette of the palace. They boiled the water carefully in long-handled pots, poured with elaborate precision, and served the sultan in small porcelain cups cradled in filigreed holders. There were rules about the foam, about the temperature, about the way the tray should be held. Even the pauses in service were choreographed. Coffee had become a symbol of refinement, but like many courtly traditions, it was also a symbol of hierarchy. The coffee served in the Sultan's court was not the same as that poured in the back streets of Tahtakali. It was stronger, finer. It came with exotic spices and rare sugars. The ritual said, "We drink the same drink, but we are not the same." Bundi, the harems of the palace, coffee took on another layer of meaning. For women, especially the concubines and wives cloistered in the imperial quarters, coffee was both a pleasure and a lifeline. It was served during morning greetings, evening gossip, and long stretches of idle waiting. Some used it as an excuse to speak privately with attendants or pass messages. There are records, quiet, dusty ones, of love letters and tiny bundles of herbs slipped under coffee saucers. In a place where words were watched, a shared cup could mean more than a paragraph. Outside the palace, in the neighborhoods of Istanbul, the rhythm of coffee was simpler, but no less meaningful. Vendors wandered through the streets with trays slung over their shoulders, selling cups from brass urns. Market stalls set up tiny brewing stations, balancing kettles over hot coals. And at the heart of the neighborhood, there was always the coffee house, each one a little world of its own. Some catered to storytellers and poets, others to gamblers and soldiers. There were coffee houses for Greek speakers, Armenian artisans, Persian travelers. In Galata, the port district, coffee houses buzzed with sailors and smugglers. In Üsküdar, on the Asian side of the Bosporus, they were quiet, sleepy, filled with scholars and pilgrims. The state no longer banned these places, but it didn't forget them either. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Ottoman authorities quietly surveilled coffee houses. Informants were planted. Licenses were required. Some establishments were periodically raided under the pretense of moral hygiene. The sultans were no longer terrified of coffee, but they still recognized its potential. It was, as ever, a drink that made people talk, and talking was dangerous. Still, life inside the coffee house rolled on. It wasn't revolutionary anymore. It was rhythmic, a place for old men to doze in the afternoon sun, for boys to run errands carrying cups balanced on tin trays, for beggars to warm their hands in winter, for neighbors to ask after each other's health, and perhaps that was the quiet triumph of coffee in the Ottoman world. It outlasted the fear. It survived the bans. It resisted the logic of control, not by winning a great battle, but by persisting in 1,000 small ways, by being a habit. And then, of course, it spread. You may have heard the story of the siege of Vienna in 1683, when the Ottomans left behind bags of coffee beans in their retreat. The Austrians, unfamiliar with the substance, nearly mistook it for camel feed. But one man, an Armenian or possibly a Polish merchant, depending on which account you believe, recognized the value and opened one of Europe's first coffee houses. That story may be embellished, but the spread of coffee from the Ottoman world to Europe is not. Venetian traders brought beans into Italy by the sackful. French envoys wrote home about the strange black broth served in Constantinople. The English, ever pragmatic, commercialized the drink quickly, first in coffee houses, then in colonial plantations. But they inherited only the surface. They did not see or chose to forget the centuries of debate, surveillance, rebellion, and storytelling that had accompanied the drink's rise in the Ottoman world. Today, coffee is everywhere. It's a morning ritual, a productivity aid, a cafe aesthetic. But in the Ottoman Empire, it was something else entirely. It was a risk, a pleasure, a space, a spark. So next time you cradle your cup, whatever you filled it with, pause just for a moment, and remember that this bitter little drink once nearly brought an empire to its knees, not through force, not through violence, but through something far more boring and far more dangerous. A place where people talked. The boring postal routes that held empires together. Hooves, dust, and silence. Inside the Persian chopper system. If you picture an ancient empire, you likely think of grand palaces, epic battles, or the commanding voices of kings. But here's something to consider. No empire, no matter how powerful, can function if it can't send a message. That message might be a royal order, a tax demand, or a cry for help. And if it doesn't arrive on time, intact, and understood, then even the most golden of thrones will crumble. This is where we begin, not with kings, but with couriers. Let's go back to the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian dynasty, stretching across what is now Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, parts of Central Asia, even bits of India and Greece. At its height, in the 5th century BCE, the empire was vast, multilingual, and dizzyingly diverse. And yet, somehow, messages sent from Susa or Persepolis could reach Sardis, over 2,500 kilometers away, within days. The secret? An unassuming, dusty network of post roads known as the Chaparkhane system. Imagine a straight road, cut through desert, mountain, and plain, stretching across half a continent. Along this road, every 20 to 30 kilometers is a relay station. At each station, fresh horses, rested riders, simple food, and basic shelter. The courier rides hard from one station to the next, dismounts, hands off the message, and the next. Man takes over. The message never sleeps, and in just over a week it has crossed an empire. The system was simple but ruthless in its efficiency. These riders, called chapar, were not romanticized messengers or noble emissaries. They were trained, timed, and replaceable. Their job was not to speak, but to deliver. In a way, they were machines long before machines existed. Herodotus, the Greek historian, admired them in a way that's become oddly familiar. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed. That quote, by the way, is now etched above the entrance to the New York City post office, but it came from Persia, and in Persia it was more than poetry. It was infrastructure. The Chapar system wasn't just used by kings, it was controlled by kings. Darius I, the administrative mastermind of the empire, is believed to have formalized the system around 500 BCE. He didn't just conquer lands, he connected them, and connection required trust, speed, and consistency. Consider the road itself. The royal road stretched from Susa to Sardis, over 2,700 kilometers. It wasn't a soft trail, it was paved in sections, guarded in others, and regularly maintained. Rest stops had food and water, and travelers often found shade in the form of planted trees. Bridges crossed rivers. Ferry systems operated at certain junctions. For the 5th century BCE, this was breathtakingly advanced, and still, most people never noticed it because the road wasn't built for them, it was built for the state. The average farmer or merchant wasn't using the full extent of the royal road. Travel permits were required. Unauthorized use of the Chapar stations was punishable. This was an imperial artery, unseen but vital. The messages that passed through it were orders, warnings, decrees. Some were administrative, others life or death. A military commander in Bactria might be summoned to Babylon with 2 days' notice. A shipment of silver from Egypt might be rerouted to pay for mercenaries in Asia Minor. A satrap who grew too independent might receive a politely worded letter, followed by soldiers if he hesitated to reply. But the Chapar system was more than a communication tool. It was a symbol. Its efficiency said something, that the king sees everything, that no matter how far away you are from the capital, the empire can reach you. In that way, the Chapar was a psychological weapon. The speed of the message implied the speed of retaliation. Still, like all imperial tools, the system had its quiet vulnerabilities. Weather, of course, could be brutal. The same road might cross snowy peaks in winter and searing deserts in summer. There were no shock absorbers, no covered carriages. Couriers suffered injuries, frostbite, and exhaustion. Their names were rarely recorded. Even more dangerous were human interruptions. Bandits, border skirmishes, and local rebellions sometimes disrupted the flow. And since each station depended on the one before and after, a single breakdown could stall a message for days. Despite these flaws, the system endured, not just for a few decades, but for centuries. Later empires, the Parthians, the Sasanians, borrowed and built upon it. Even the Islamic caliphates that followed adopted the same model. Relay stations, official couriers, roads designed for state communication rather than public use. But the original Persian Chapar remained the blueprint, the invisible backbone of an empire that prided itself not only on power but on order. And yet, as you sit now and think of those long-forgotten hoofbeats echoing through valleys and over stone bridges, you might ask if these messengers kept an empire stitched together. What happened when the road finally went quiet? When the road broke, disruption, decay, and adaptation. By the 4th century BCE, the once reliable thrum of hooves across the royal road began to fade. It wasn't immediate. Empires rarely fall in a single season, but the once tight stitching of the Achaemenid communication network began to unravel, not because the road disappeared, but because the authority behind it weakened. The cracks started at the top. Following the reign of Darius Darius I and his son Xerxes, the Achaemenid kings became increasingly disconnected from their satraps, the governors appointed to manage the far-flung provinces. These satraps had once been monitored through steady, swift communication via the chapar system. Orders came quickly. Compliance could be verified, but over time, gaps began to appear. Sometimes a message wasn't delivered. Sometimes it was delayed. And in the silence between one letter and the next, a satrap might wonder, what if I just didn't reply? For a while, nothing would happen, and that silence was louder than any order. It signaled opportunity. What had once been a tight bureaucracy became increasingly futile. Satraps hoarded taxes, commanded private armies, made treaties behind the king's back, and because the communication network no longer worked the way it had, the central authority couldn't keep up. To the naked eye, the roads still looked the same. Stations stood, horses stood tethered, the dust still swirled underfoot. But the speed of the empire had changed, and in the ancient world, speed was everything. It's tempting to think that the collapse of the Persian courier system was simply a result of military defeat, namely, the arrival of Alexander the Great. But that's only part of the story. When Alexander invaded Persia in the 330s BCE, he didn't just march with swords and siege engines. He also marched with information. He moved fast because he had learned about the Persian system and used it against them. His general sent messages ahead. His scouts used existing roads. He recruited Persian satraps and administrators who already knew the relay stations and the people who ran them. In short, he hijacked the postal network. That's how weak it had become. And after the conquest, Alexander didn't destroy the roads. He expanded them. Under the Seleucid Empire, the Persian relay model merged with Macedonian military logistics and Hellenistic administrative customs. New roads were built, old stations were renamed, but the basic pattern remained. Still, something had shifted. The imperial postal system of the Achaemenids had been centralized. All power flowed from the king. The Seleucid adaptation was regionalized. Communication varied depending on which corner of the empire you lived in. Some areas had full courier service. Others fell into private arrangements. Some stations simply stopped operating. Over time, other empires came and went. The Parthians, 247 BCE, 224 CE, famous for their cavalry and decentralized control, maintained a looser version of the system. They were less interested in uniform bureaucracy than in letting local leaders manage their own regions. Messages still traveled, but they weren't part of a single web. They were fragments of many. Yet even in that fragmented state, the concept of imperial post, of controlled, fast official communication, never died out. In fact, during the reign of the Sasanian Empire, 224-651 CE, the old Persian courier tradition made something of a comeback. The Sasanians were reformers. They brought back strong central bureaucracy and re-established something resembling the old chapar stations, now called periodization. These stations were staffed by both government couriers and scribes. They maintained meticulous records. Seals were required on official correspondence. Distances were standardized. This was in some ways the ancient world's closest approximation to a civil postal service. But again, it wasn't for the people, it was for the state. And just like before, the system was vulnerable to overextension. In 627 CE, during a war with the Byzantine Empire, Sasanian control over their outer provinces collapsed rapidly. Why? Not because their army was weak, but because their couriers couldn't reach their governors. Roads were disrupted by weather, raiders, and rebellion. Commanders in distant provinces waited days for orders that never came. The state didn't fall in battle. It fell in silence. And then came the Islamic caliphates, the Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid caliphates, each in their own turn, adopted and adapted the Persian system. The Arabic term for the state postal service became the barad, derived from earlier Persian practices. The barad was more than a courier network. It was also a surveillance tool. Couriers reported not only on the letters they carried, but on the governors they visited. Their job was to observe, to listen, to watch. In this way, the road spoke not only for the caliph, but about his subjects. And though the empires changed, the bones of the system endured. The Mongols would later adopt similar relay systems known as the Yam, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. The Byzantines maintained official messengers on horseback. Even in medieval Europe, royal roads echoed the old Persian model, though less efficiently. The Shapar was no longer Persian. It had become imperial, and always it was invisible to most. No coins were struck in the Shapar's honor. No monuments commemorated the relay riders. Their names were rarely recorded. Their contributions were not celebrated, but they were there, galloping through wind and snow, splashing across rivers, waiting in the quiet dark of a desert station, watching the horizon for dust. Their work didn't conquer lands, it held them. Still, one question lingers. How could a system so vital be so utterly forgotten? The forgotten arteries of empire. If the story of the Persian courier system teaches us anything, it is that infrastructure is invisible when it works, and unforgettable only when it fails. By the time the medieval world rolled in, with its patchwork, kingdoms and shifting borders, the model of organized state communication had fragmented again. But its bones, those same bones laid down by Darius and his administrators, remained buried beneath every state effort to organize power through speed. In early medieval Europe, communication was local and irregular. The Roman cursus publicus, ADO, courier system, inspired in part by Persian methods, had long collapsed. Kings sent messengers by horse, but roads were poor, permissions unclear, and corruption frequent. But even amid this chaos, the idea lingered that a sovereign, if he wanted to be truly sovereign, needed a road and someone to ride it. That idea never left. You can see echoes of it in the relay stations set up by Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. The Yam, with fresh horses, supply depots, and food every 40 kilometers, enabling riders to travel hundreds of kilometers a day. Genghis recognized what Darius had understood 1,000 years earlier. Conquest was only half the work. Control required communication. Likewise, in the Ottoman Empire, the Ulak courier system maintained lines between governors, tax officials, and the Sultan. Couriers operated with strict hierarchies and carefully timed routes. Though slower and less centralized than earlier Persian or Mongol systems, the principle remained: you're not governing if you're not reaching. But none of these later systems quite matched the scale and simplicity of the original Shapari. Kana. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't involve great military victories. It didn't dazzle with technological novelty, but it worked, and for that reason, it was copied, reshaped, reimagined by civilization after civilization, not because it was flashy, but because it was boring and dependable. And then came the printing press, and the newspaper, and the telegraph, and the train. The speed of thought began to outpace the speed of hooves. Communication ceased to be physical. The dusty roads of Persia, once the bleeding edge of imperial logistics, faded into irrelevance. But here's the odd thing. The language of those ancient roads remains. When you say something is in the pipeline, when you talk about being on the same page, when you expect an express delivery, you're echoing a world of physical movement, where knowledge, power, and presence had to travel together in a leather pouch, slung across the back of a galloping horse. Even the very idea of being connected comes from the old postal roads. They connected places that had little else in common. Different languages, currencies, faiths. They made possible a unity that did not come from culture, but from coordination. But in the end, the Persian chapar system wasn't remembered the way battles are remembered. No monuments, no museums, just fragments in Herodotus. A quote on a post office wall, a forgotten road in the dust. And maybe that's the point. In history, the loudest stories are often about collapse, but the quiet ones, the ones that whisper of endurance, routine, and the daily grind of administration, those are what actually hold everything together. So as you drift now quietly, consider the rhythm of hooves in the ancient dark, not racing toward battle, not chasing glory, just delivering because someone, somewhere, needed. The forgotten monks who measured the world candles, sand, and silence. Timekeeping in a cloistered world. Imagine waking in the dark to the faint clang of a bell echoing down a stone corridor. Not the kind of bell that marks the hour on a grand tower clock, but a dull, deliberate tone, softened by woolen robes and stone walls. It is the second watch of the night, and Brother Elfric, like the other monks of his Benedictine order, rises from his narrow cot to begin matins, the first of the 8 daily canonical hours. He does not check his phone. He does not look at a sundial. He listens to the rhythm of ritual, to the measured silence between the tolls. In the medieval monasteries of Western Europe, time did not belong to the individual. It belonged to God, and keeping track of it, measuring it, was a sacred duty. But how do you track time when clocks don't yet exist? The answer, as it turns out, was equal parts ingenuity and persistence. And monks like Brother Elfric, cloistered, silent, deliberate, became the keepers of time for a continent that had mostly forgotten how to measure it. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, much of Europe fell into what historians once called the Dark Ages. While that term is rightly criticized today, it's fair to say that centralized systems of knowledge, especially regarding astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, became fragmented. Public timekeeping, once managed by sundials and water clocks in Roman cities, largely disappeared outside the Mediterranean world. But in the silence of monastic life, time still had to be kept, not for commerce, not for transit, not for empire, but for prayer. Benedict of Nursia, the 6th century founder of the Benedictine order, prescribed a strict schedule, 8 services every 24 hours, each corresponding to a specific time of day or night. These were not casual guidelines, they were binding. And so monasteries had to know, when is midnight, when is dawn, when is terce, the 3rd hour of the day. At first, monks relied on natural cues, sunrise, stars, the crow of the cock. But these were unreliable. What about cloudy days, long winter nights, How could one prey on time if time itself refused to cooperate? So they began experimenting. In warmer climates, water clocks were used. Vessels with small holes that allowed water to drip at a steady rate. In cooler northern monasteries where water might freeze, candle clocks were preferred. A standard candle, marked with measured intervals, could burn for a known length of time. 6 inches might mean 1 hour. A monk on night duty could simply monitor the flame, extinguish it at a set point, and light another, keeping time by firelight. Some monasteries developed sand timers, not unlike the modern hourglass, to measure shorter intervals during the day. Others, more ambitious, turned to the stars, constructing rotating star maps or volvels to estimate hour changes during the night sky's procession. And still others listened to bells rung at intervals, to footsteps on stone, to the slow, practiced routine of daily repetition. A novice monk might learn to track time by internal rhythm alone, training his mind to sense the passing hours through chant, prayer, and stillness. It was, in a way, a deeply human technology, one where the body, the spirit, and the ticking of the universe all merged. This may sound inefficient. It was, but it worked. And because it worked, monasteries began to accumulate something very few people in early medieval Europe had: a memory of time. They recorded sunrise and sunset across the year. They tracked solstices and equinoxes. They copied Roman texts on astronomy and lunar cycles. And, over centuries, these quiet men in plain robes became not just caretakers of faith, but caretakers of the calendar. Consider the sheer impact. When Charlemagne needed a standardized liturgical calendar for his empire, he turned to monastic scribes. When medieval kings consulted astrologers or planned coronations, they often relied on monastic calculations of eclipses and feast days. These monks weren't inventors in the modern sense, but they were maintainers, caretakers of ideas passed down from Rome, Greece, and Alexandria. They preserved the mechanics of time. And in a Europe of chaos and conflict, where local lords ruled by sword and whim, the monastery bell became the most regular sound in the land. Each ring was not just a call to prayer, it was a declaration: this moment matters. But here's the quiet irony. As monasteries got better at timekeeping, time itself became more fragmented. In trying to measure it, they also began to divide it into hours, into services, into tasks. The very act of slicing the day for devotion laid the groundwork for a world where time would eventually be sliced for everything: work, wages, trains, production. But we're not there yet. In Brother Elfric's world, the candle still burns slowly, the bell still tolls at night, and in that small, cold cell, time moves, not quickly, but intentionally. Still, one has to wonder, how did the monks move from candle clocks and sand to the gears and springs of real mechanical time? From candlelight to clockwork, the dawn of mechanical timekeeping. As the centuries passed, the slow, steady rhythm of monastic life gradually intertwined with new technologies and fresh ideas. The simple tools of candle clocks and sand timers remained useful, but curiosity and necessity were pushing beyond their limits. By the late Middle Ages, monasteries and cathedral workshops across Europe began experimenting with more complex timekeeping devices: early mechanical clocks. These early clocks weren't the precise, polished wristwatches we know today. They were often enormous wooden or iron constructions, driven by weights and gears carefully balanced and crafted by skilled artisans. Their goal was straightforward but ambitious: to mark the passage of hours automatically, without constant human intervention. This mechanical revolution was slow and uneven. Early clocks often chimed only once every hour, rather than showing minutes or seconds, and many were prone to inaccuracies. But the symbolic impact was profound. No longer did time depend solely on the rise and fall of the sun, or the fragile flame of a candle. Now it could be measured mechanically. The first recorded mechanical clock in Europe appeared in the late 13th century, around 1283 in England, at the cathedral in Norwich. From there, the idea spread slowly but surely. Monasteries were often the first patrons and users of these clocks, installing them in their towers to regulate prayers more strictly and publicly. Bells rang out across towns and villages, marking the hours for all to hear. But the rise of mechanical clocks also coincided with the increasing secularization of time. For centuries, time had been mainly about religious devotion, canonical hours, feast days, Lent. But as towns grew, trade expanded and guilds flourished. Time became a tool for business and daily life. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the regulation of time extended beyond monastic walls. Guilds in Florence and Paris began to use clocks to coordinate work shifts. Markets opened and closed according to the ringing bells. Journeymen and apprentices kept track of their hours, and penalties were enforced for tardiness. The mechanical clock was transforming society, quietly and gradually, but irrevocably. Monks like Brother Elfric, if they could see forward, might have felt a strange mix of pride and confusion. The discipline of prayer and reflection was becoming just one part of a world increasingly driven by schedules, appointments, and deadlines. Yet, the monks' patient work was the seed from which this new understanding of time grew. It was their careful observation, their preservation of astronomical knowledge, and their drive to measure the intangible that laid the foundation for modern timekeeping. Of course, the journey was not without challenges. Mechanical clocks were expensive, delicate, and often failed in damp or cold conditions. Master clockmakers guarded their designs carefully, and throughout the Renaissance and beyond, debates raged over the nature of time itself, whether it was absolute or relative, linear or cyclical. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued to experience time differently, marked by daylight seasons and agricultural cycles. Still, the march of mechanical time was unstoppable, and it would eventually reach every corner of the globe, synchronizing nations, enabling navigation, and transforming daily life. But this raises an intriguing question. How did the leap from mechanical clocks lead to the precise atomic timekeeping of today? And more importantly, what did it mean for human life to move from spiritual time to clock time and beyond? The legacy of monastic timekeeping in a modern world. The mechanical clocks of the late medieval period marked a turning point, but they were just the beginning of a centuries-long transformation in how humanity perceives and organizes time. By the 17th century, the invention of the pendulum clock by Christian Huygens brought unprecedented accuracy to timekeeping. This invention not only allowed for better coordination of daily life, but also fueled advancements in navigation and science. From the precise ticking of pendulums grew the development of watches, chronometers, and eventually, in the 20th century, atomic clocks, devices so accurate they can measure time to a billionth of a second. All this began quietly in stone cloisters, where monks observed, recorded, and measured time not for convenience or profit, but as an act of devotion. But what does this mean for us today? In modern society, time dominates nearly every aspect of life. We schedule meetings, coordinate transportation, manage work shifts, and track productivity, all under the governance of mechanical, then digital, clocks. Yet, despite the precision and ubiquity of modern timekeeping, many of us feel rushed, disconnected from the natural rhythms once observed by those medieval monks. The quiet candlelight of Brother Elfric's world, where time was a guide to reflection and spiritual connection, seems far removed from our frantic, clock-driven lives. This contrast invites reflection on how technology transforms not only our capabilities, but our experience of life itself. Are we measuring time, or is time measuring us? And might there be value in occasionally stepping back into the slow, intentional rhythms of those long-forgotten monks to remember that sometimes the most profound moments come not from rushing forward, but from quiet patience and presence? As you settle into rest, consider this: the clocks around us, from grand cathedral towers to the smartphone in your hand, are heirs to a tradition of silent watchers who measured the world not to control it, but to understand it. The secret lives of medieval town criers' voices in the square. How town criers shaped everyday life. In a world without newspapers, televisions, or radios, the town crier was the vital link between the authorities and the common people. These loud-voiced messengers carried news, proclamations, and sometimes gossip from the lord or monarch to every corner of the village or city square. Though it might sound mundane, just someone shouting announcements, the town crier's role was surprisingly complex and essential. They weren't simply noisy heralds, they were trusted communicators, often responsible for conveying laws, market updates, and warnings of impending danger. Throughout medieval Europe, and even into early modern times, town criers held a unique position between rulers and the ruled. This story begins in a small English market town in the 14th century, where John the Crier's voice was as familiar as the church bell. John's day started long before dawn. Clad in a brightly colored tabard, he carried a large handbell that rang out sharply through the morning mist, calling people to attention. His announcements covered everything from the latest royal edicts to the times of fairs, taxes due, and even lost livestock. But beyond the official messages, John's role included a subtle but crucial element: building community trust. In a largely illiterate society, the town crier was often the only source of information for many residents. Their voice carried authority, but also familiarity, and with that authority came responsibility. John's announcements had to be accurate. Mistakes could lead to confusion or even unrest. He was sometimes accompanied by the local constable, especially when delivering proclamations about laws or punishments. Despite the public nature of his work, John's life was far from easy. Weather was a constant enemy. Rain, snow, or bitter cold made his rounds difficult. His voice had to be strong enough to carry over crowds and noise, and yet he needed to guard against losing it altogether. In the quieter moments between announcements, John was often a source of informal news and gossip, a conduit for the everyday stories that bound the town together. But the crier's job was also precarious. He was a public figure subject to scrutiny. Speaking out of turn or relaying rumors could land him in trouble. Sometimes crier voices were deliberately silenced by those in power When news became inconvenient, the role balanced on a fine edge between service and censorship. This delicate dance shaped the very fabric of civic life long before print media or digital news. So what did it mean to be the voice of the people when you held the only megaphone in town? And how did the job evolve as societies moved toward printed newspapers and faster communication? Echoes of authority, power, politics, and the town crier's influence as John's bell echoed through the bustling market square. The role of the town crier was evolving beyond mere messenger. By the late Middle Ages, towns and cities were becoming centers of political life, commerce, and social change, and the crier, once simply the voice of the lord or magistrate, was increasingly caught in the currents of power. In many places, town criers became trusted intermediaries, not just delivering decrees but shaping public opinion, because their announcements were often the only information many people had. The words they spoke carried weight, and sometimes that weight turned into influence. For example, during times of political unrest or religious conflict, the town crier could be the first to announce royal proclamations banning gatherings or declaring new taxes. How these messages were delivered mattered. A harsh tone might inflame tempers. A gentle one could calm fears. In some towns, criers were instructed to read not just the letter of the law, but explanations to help the public understand new regulations. This blurred the line between communication and persuasion. At the same time, criers faced dangers. Spreading unpopular news such as tax increases or conscriptions could provoke hostility from angry crowds. There are records of criers being threatened, attacked, or even run out of towns. Despite this, their position was often protected by law. In England, for instance, it was illegal to harm a town crier while he was on duty. This legal protection underscored how vital their role was perceived. Yet, with rising literacy rates and the spread of printing presses in the 15th century, the crier's monopoly on information began to erode. Newspapers and pamphlets brought news directly to literate citizens. Still, in many rural or less literate areas, the town crier remained essential well into the 18th century. Beyond the public square, criers sometimes worked as informal spies or informants for local authorities, reporting on dissent or unrest. This dual role complicated their relationship with the community, both trusted voices and enforcers of authority. The town crier's story is a reminder that communication is never neutral. It's wrapped up in power, trust, and the delicate balance between speaking truth and serving those in charge. But how did this ancient role finally fade away, and what replaced the town crier in the noisy, fast-paced information age? The last bell toll. Decline and legacy of the town crier. As the centuries turned, the steady clanging of the town crier's bell began to wane. The rise of printed newspapers, wider literacy, and later telegraph and radio transformed how people received news. By the 18th and 19th centuries, newspapers were widely available in urban centers, and literacy rates had climbed enough that more and more people could read the news themselves. The town crier's voice, once indispensable, gradually became a quaint relic of the past. However, far from disappearing entirely, the town crier's role shifted. In some communities, criers became ceremonial figures, appearing at festivals, parades, and official events, preserving the tradition and reminding people of a time when news traveled by foot and bell. The office of the town crier still exists in some places today, though mostly as a symbol rather than a necessity. Their legacy, however, runs deeper than just a quaint tradition. They remind us that communication is fundamentally about trust and community. In an age before digital devices and instant messaging, the town crier was the human link, an essential living broadcast, and their story invites us to consider how we today navigate the flood of information around us. Are we always listening carefully? Or do we sometimes lose the human voice? Beneath the noise, as you rest, imagine the echo of that old bell ringing through centuries, a call to attention, a bridge between rulers and the ruled, a voice that once shaped everyday life in the quietest and loudest of ways. The day the sun stood still, how a solar eclipse changed a kingdom. Section 1, Darkness at Noon. The solar eclipse that stirred fear and awe on a bright summer day in the year 585 BCE. An event occurred that halted the ordinary rhythms of life across a large part of the ancient world. A solar eclipse. To the people of the time, an eclipse was more than just a natural phenomenon. It was a cosmic omen, a mysterious interruption of the sun's daily journey, which often inspired fear, reverence, or dread. The story begins in the kingdom of Lydia, ruled by King Alyattes. On that fateful day, as the sun was high in the sky, darkness suddenly enveloped the land. Farmers paused in their fields, merchants stopped their trading, and soldiers halted their training. The birds fell silent, and a chill swept through the air. This solar eclipse was so sudden and complete that it appeared as if the sun itself had vanished. Ancient people, lacking scientific explanation, often believed such events were signs from the gods, warnings or messages to be interpreted carefully. King Alyattes, upon hearing reports of the eclipse, was deeply unsettled. This celestial darkness had fallen during a tense period. His kingdom was engaged in a long and bloody war with the neighboring Medes. The sudden eclipse was widely seen as a divine intervention in the conflict. According to the historian Herodotus, who later chronicled this event, the eclipse was so startling that it brought an immediate ceasefire. The two warring kings agreed to halt hostilities and negotiated a peace treaty that reshaped the region. The unexpected darkness had, in effect, stopped the war in its tracks. Yet, this story raises questions that echo through history. How did ancient societies interpret such celestial events without the tools of modern astronomy? And how did moments of shared fear and wonder shape the decisions of rulers and peoples alike? Omens and alliances, understanding the eclipse in ancient times. The sudden plunge into darkness during the solar eclipse of 585 BCE was not just a natural event. It became a powerful symbol that resonated deeply with the beliefs and fears of ancient peoples. In Lydia and Media, and across many ancient cultures, celestial phenomena were seen as messages from the divine realm, signs that could dictate the fate of kings and kingdoms. Without telescopes or scientific knowledge, people turned to priests, shamans, and astrologers to interpret these omens. The timing of the eclipse during an ongoing war seemed too significant to be mere coincidence. For King Alyattes and his counterpart in Media, Cyaxares, the eclipse was interpreted as a clear sign that the gods demanded peace. The shared experience of awe and fear created a moment where both sides saw reason in halting their conflict. This moment of celestial interruption thus became a catalyst For diplomacy, the peace treaty that followed ended decades of warfare and allowed both kingdoms to stabilize and grow stronger. It also set a precedent for how powerful natural phenomena could influence human politics. But how did ancient societies predict or understand such events? Surprisingly, some cultures had developed early astronomical knowledge. Babylonian astronomers, for instance, could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy, although this knowledge was often reserved for elites. In many cases, the common people remained unaware of the precise nature of eclipses, which maintained the aura of mystery and fear. The eclipse of 585 BCE also inspired later philosophers and scientists. Anaxagoras, a pre-Socratic thinker, is said to have been one of the first to offer a natural explanation for eclipses, proposing that they were caused by the moon blocking the sun. This marked the beginning of a shift from supernatural to scientific understanding. Yet, the tension between fear, faith, and reason persisted. Even today, eclipses can evoke a mix of wonder and superstition in many cultures. This ancient event raises deeper questions. How do humans balance the mysterious and the rational when confronted with the unknown? And what role does shared experience of nature's power play in shaping human history? From darkness to dawn, the lasting impact of the 585 BCE eclipse, the solar eclipse that suddenly darkened the skies over Lydia and Media in 585 BCE, was more than a celestial spectacle. It was a moment that rippled through history in subtle but lasting ways. The immediate effect was clear: an abrupt end to a brutal decades-long war. By halting the fighting, the eclipse forced leaders on both sides to negotiate and seek peace. This truce paved the way for a period of relative stability, economic growth, and cultural exchange between the two kingdoms. But beyond the political consequences, the event had a profound influence on how humans perceived the cosmos and their place within it. It inspired early attempts to understand natural phenomena through observation and reasoning, sowing seeds for scientific thought. The eclipse also reinforced the idea that nature, in its unpredictable power, could disrupt human affairs in unexpected ways. This notion has echoed through history, from medieval plagues interpreted as divine punishment to modern-day weather events shaping economies and societies. Interestingly, the story of the 585 BCE eclipse endures as a symbol of how moments of shared awe and fear can bring people together, even amid conflict. In our own times, eclipses still capture global attention, reminding us of the delicate balance between certainty and mystery. As you rest now, consider the strange power of darkness at midday, and how it once made kings reconsider their choices. How often do moments beyond our control force us to pause, reflect, or change course? And what lessons might lie hidden in the skies above, waiting for us to notice? The Quiet Revolution: how salt changed medieval economies. White gold: the hidden power of salt in the Middle Ages. Salt, often taken for granted today, was once one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. Known as white gold, it was essential not only for seasoning food but for preserving it, especially in a time before refrigeration. In medieval Europe, salt was the backbone of daily survival and economic power. The story begins in the salt-producing region of Salzburg in modern-day Austria, where salt mines were so rich that the city's name literally means Salt Castle. Salt was mined, transported, and traded across vast distances, linking economies from the mountains to the seas. Its value was immense. In some places, salt was even used as currency. But why was salt so critical? Before modern preservation, salt was the only reliable way to keep meat, fish, and vegetables from spoiling. This made it vital for feeding armies, merchants, and growing urban populations. Salt's importance also gave rise to powerful trade routes and monopolies. Control over salt sources meant control over wealth and influence. Kings, nobles, and monasteries often imposed heavy taxes on salt, sometimes sparking unrest among common folk. For example, the French gabelle was a notorious salt tax that fueled resentment and eventually contributed to revolutionary tensions centuries later. Beyond economics, salt shaped culture and religion. It was used in rituals, seen as a symbol of purity and preservation. In some societies, offering salt was a gesture of hospitality and alliance, but producing and transporting salt was no easy task. Salt mines were dangerous and exhausting places. Caravans carrying salt across deserts or mountains faced bandits and harsh conditions. This network of salt trade was a complex web that connected distant regions and people. Yet, despite its importance, the everyday details of salt's journey are often overlooked. This story invites you to uncover the quiet but vital role salt played in shaping medieval life and to wonder, how did something so simple become so powerful? The Quiet Revolution: How Salt Changed Medieval Economies. Section 2. Roots of White Gold. Trade, taxation, and tension. The medieval salt trade was a sprawling network of routes, markets, and players, stretching across continents and connecting cities, villages, and kingdoms. From the salt mines of Salzburg and the coasts of the Mediterranean to the salt pans of England and the salt marshes of northern Europe, this mineral shaped economies in surprising ways. Caravans laden with blocks of salt traveled long distances, often on difficult and dangerous terrain. Merchants and mule drivers braved mountain passes, deserts, and bandit-infested roads, ensuring this precious commodity reached markets far from its source. Because salt was so valuable, controlling its production and distribution became a matter of power. Many rulers imposed heavy taxes on salt, seeing it as a reliable source of revenue. In France, the gabelle was a salt tax imposed from the 14th century onward. It required all subjects to purchase salt from government suppliers at fixed prices, creating resentment among peasants and merchants alike. This unpopular tax was one of the factors contributing to unrest that eventually culminated in the French Revolution centuries later. In England, the crown also controlled salt production and imposed taxes, but these often varied regionally. In some cases, salt works were owned by monasteries, which used the income to support their religious and charitable activities. The tension over salt taxes illustrates how a simple mineral could become a flashpoint between rulers and the ruled. Besides economics and politics, salt influenced social customs. It was considered a symbol of hospitality. Sharing salt at a meal was a gesture of trust and friendship. In many cultures, salt was used in religious ceremonies to purify and protect. The very survival of communities often depended on access to salt. Yet despite its importance, many people had little idea where their salt came from, or the struggles involved in its production. The mines were grueling workplaces, and the journeys to transport salt were fraught with peril. But this invisible labor powered kingdoms and markets. The story of salt is a quiet revolution, a reminder that the mundane substances we rely on can shape history in profound ways. What other overlooked essentials might hold similar hidden power? Crystals of change, the lasting impact of salt on society and economy. By the late Middle Ages, salt had firmly cemented its role as a cornerstone of medieval economies and societies. Its influence extended beyond simple preservation to shaping trade networks, political power, and cultural practices that endured for centuries. The wealth generated from salt mining and trade funded castles, armies, and religious institutions, making it a silent engine of development. But salt's power also sparked resistance. Heavy taxation and monopolies on salt led to protests, smuggling, and sometimes violent clashes. The French gabelle, in particular, became a symbol of oppression that helped fuel revolutionary fervor. On a cultural level, salt's symbolism continued to evolve. From sacred rituals to daily meals, salt remained a marker of community and trust. In some traditions, the phrase, "worth one's salt," originated as a recognition of value and contribution. Today, while salt is ubiquitous and inexpensive, its medieval legacy remains. The trade routes it created contributed to early globalization, linking distant regions and peoples. The political struggles it sparked remind us how even basic necessities can become sites of power and conflict. As you drift towards sleep, reflect on the unassuming crystal of salt, a substance that quietly preserved not just food, but the fabric of medieval life itself. How might the simple things we take for granted today be shaping our future in ways we don't yet understand? The forgotten artisans, how medieval tailors shaped fashion and society. Section 1. Needles and thread. The life of a medieval tailor in the bustling towns and cities of medieval Europe. A quiet group of skilled workers stitched together more than just clothes. They wove the social fabric of their communities. Medieval tailors were essential artisans who crafted garments for all classes, from peasants to nobles. Their work demanded precision, patience, and an eye for detail, qualities that made them respected members of guilds and towns alike. Tailoring in the Middle Ages was more than simple sewing. It involved knowledge of textiles, patterns, and the latest fashions imported from across Europe and beyond. Tailors had to understand not only how to cut and sew, but also how to make clothing that fit and flattered different body types. The materials they worked with ranged widely, from coarse wool and linen worn by the poor to fine silks and velvets for the wealthy. Guilds regulated the profession, setting standards for quality, prices, and apprenticeships. These guilds provided tailors with social status, protection, and sometimes political influence within their towns. The daily life of a tailor was demanding. From dawn to dusk, they measured, cut, stitched, and mended. Their workshops were often small, cramped spaces filled with bolts of fabric, needles, scissors, and sewing frames. Despite the hard work, tailoring offered a path to stable income and community standing. Clothing was vital in medieval society, not only for warmth and modesty, but also as a visible sign of status and identity. The clothes a person wore could mark their profession, wealth, or allegiance. This made the tailor's role crucial in shaping not just fashion but social order. Yet the individual stories of these artisans are often lost in grand historical narratives. What did it feel like to sew the garments of kings and commoners alike? How did tailors navigate the challenges of changing fashions, economic pressures and social expectations. The forgotten artisans. How medieval tailors shaped fashion and society. Section 2. Stitching society. Guilds, fashion, and influence. As medieval towns grew and prospered, tailors found themselves at the heart of a complex web of social and economic relationships. Tailoring guilds. Often powerful local institutions controlled who could practice the trade and how. These guilds maintained high standards for workmanship and enforced strict rules about apprenticeship and training. Joining a guild was a long process, requiring years of learning and producing a masterpiece to prove skill. Guild members took pride in their craft and worked collectively to protect their interests. Tailors also played a key role in the diffusion of fashion trends across Europe. Fabrics, dyes, and styles traveled via trade routes, and tailors adapted them to local tastes and needs. Fashion was not just about aesthetics, it was a form of communication. Sumptuary laws, which regulated what people could wear based on their social class, meant that tailors had to navigate legal as well as stylistic challenges. For example, a wealthy merchant might desire a fine velvet doublet but be prohibited by law from wearing the specific color reserved for nobility. Tailors balanced creativity with these constraints, subtly altering designs to respect laws while satisfying clients. Their work influenced how people saw themselves and others. A well-tailored garment could boost confidence, signify status, or even aid in political alliances. Despite their influence, tailors often remained modest figures behind the scenes. Their labor-intensive work was rarely recorded in chronicles, yet their craft was essential to the rhythm of medieval life. The rise of urban centers increased demand for fashionable clothing, giving tailors more opportunities and challenges. They had to keep up with changing tastes, new materials, and economic ups and downs. Tailors also faced competition from itinerant workers and the challenges posed by seasonal work. All these factors made tailoring a dynamic but unpredictable livelihood. How did individual tailors adapt to these pressures? And how did their craft shape the evolving social landscapes of medieval Europe? The forgotten artisans. How medieval tailors shaped fashion and society. Section 3. Threads of legacy. Tailors' lasting impact on culture and society. The medieval tailors' craft left an imprint far beyond the fabric of their time. Through centuries of meticulous work, tailors helped define social identity and cultural expression. Their garments were more than clothes. They were symbols of belonging, aspiration, and transformation. Tailors contributed to the rise of early consumer culture, where fashion became a marker of status and individuality. The guilds they formed set early standards for craftsmanship and professional organization. These structures influenced later trades and industries, laying groundwork for the guild and union systems we know today. Tailoring also intersected with larger historical shifts. For example, as trade expanded during the late Middle Ages, new materials like silk and dyes arrived from the East, challenging tailors to innovate and adapt. The Reformation and Renaissance further altered clothing styles and social norms, with tailors often at the forefront of these changes. Yet despite their importance, tailors remained largely anonymous figures. Their names rarely survive in history books, overshadowed by kings and generals, but their work clothed those very figures, enabling the display of power and prestige. Today, when we wear clothing, we continue this legacy, each stitch connecting us to centuries of artisans who shaped society, stitch by stitch. As you relax now, Consider the hidden histories woven into every piece of fabric you own. What other quiet craftsmen and women might have shaped our world in ways we seldom notice. The lost letters. How medieval postmen kept empires together. Scrolls, seals, and saddlebags. The birth of the medieval message system. Long before modern post offices and email, messages traveled on horseback, tucked into leather pouches, carried through treacherous terrain by weary riders whose names history rarely remembers. In the Middle Ages, the ability to send letters across distances was both a luxury and a necessity, especially for rulers, merchants, and church officials. The beast story of medieval couriers, the earliest postman, is one of resilience, danger, and remarkable logistical ingenuity. The roots of medieval mail can be traced to earlier systems like the Roman cursus publicus, a state-run courier service used to send imperial decrees and military instructions. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, many parts of Europe lost organized communication systems, leading to fragmentation. But as medieval kingdoms began to form and grow, the need for reliable long-distance messaging returned. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a patchwork of communication systems began to emerge. These weren't uniform or widespread. In many regions, only the wealthy or powerful had access to written correspondence. Monasteries, for instance, often operated their own internal courier systems to connect with other abbeys. Kings and lords relied on trusted riders, sometimes referred to as nuncios, to carry their messages between distant holdings. A letter might travel hundreds of miles, passed from rider to rider, or slowly carried by a single courier, often across hostile lands. There were no post offices, no permanent roads, and few inns. Instead, these medieval messengers relied on local knowledge, memory, and sheer endurance. Messages had to be carefully sealed, often with wax and a personal stamp to prevent tampering. A broken seal was not just a security breach. It could be a declaration of war or betrayal. Sometimes important letters were even committed to memory and delivered orally, particularly when documents risked interception. What did it mean to trust a message, possibly a royal order or a plea for help, to a single rider galloping through wind and rain? And how did the slow, uncertain nature of medieval messaging shape the politics and decisions of an entire continent? Ink and influence. Who wrote the messages, and who carried them? Behind every letter in the medieval world was not just a writer, but also a scribe, a skilled individual trained in the slow and deliberate art of writing. Scribes worked in monasteries, chancelleries, and noble courts, carefully penning messages on parchment or vellum using quills and homemade ink. A single mistake could alter the meaning of a message, so clarity and formality were paramount. These scribes employed a variety of scripts depending on the region and the intended audience. Carolingian minuscule, Gothic script, or later, Humanist cursive. Some letters were straightforward commands. Others were verbose and ceremonial, written in Latin or French, full of protocol and flourishes. Once completed, letters were sealed with hot wax and the sender's distinctive signet. The seal was not only decorative, but crucial for authentication. Literally, the signature of the sender, the person who delivered that sealed document, the courier, was often chosen for their trustworthiness, loyalty, and physical endurance. In royal courts, these couriers might be low-ranking knights or professional messengers employed by the chancery. In smaller towns, A literate monk or merchant's apprentice might carry word between cities. Couriers faced great risks. Highwaymen, wars, storms, and sheer physical exhaustion. There were no proper rest stops, no maps, and no consistent road signs. They memorized routes, relied on word of mouth, and carried letters over days or weeks. Some traveled with guards, especially if the message was politically sensitive. To ensure secrecy, important dispatches were sometimes written in cipher or disguised as mundane letters. In times of war, couriers were targets. Capturing a rival's correspondence could shift the balance of power. Even in times of peace, late delivery or lost messages could disrupt marriages, alliances, and trade. Still, the system endured because it had to. Even the slowest letter was faster than silence. But this raises a question. What happened to the messages that never arrived? What decisions were delayed or never made because a horse threw a shoe or a road washed away?
Vanished voices, letters that never came, and the legacy of the medieval courier. For every letter that arrived safely in the medieval world, countless others never did. Lost to war, weather, or simple misdirection, these missing messages formed
a kind of silent archive. Histories that might have been but never were. We have records of some of these losses. A French king waiting for reinforcements that never came. A bishop's request for aid that vanished in transit. Or a merchant's letter about delayed goods that was never read. The consequences were often more than inconvenience. A single missed message could alter marriages, delay treaties, or change the course of a battle. In time, these uncertainties gave rise to new institutions. Universities, monasteries, and urban centers began organizing more consistent courier networks. Some Italian city-states developed merchant posts, and in the Holy Roman Empire, the foundations of an imperial postal system slowly emerged. By the late Middle Ages, powerful families like the Thurn and Taxis dynasty would manage postal routes that laid the groundwork for modern European mail. But even as systems improved, the essential role of the individual courier, anonymous, tired, and often forgotten, remained central. These were people who slept in stables, rode through hail, and crossed unfamiliar lands carrying words that weren't their own. Their job was to be invisible, yet history often turned on the outcomes of their journeys. And what of the letters themselves? Many were discarded once read, others preserved in archives, but most are simply gone. Disintegrated with time, they leave behind no words, only the faint trace of the hands that carried them. As you ease into rest, imagine a cold wind across a medieval plain. A lone rider presses onward, clutching a sealed scroll beneath his cloak, a message that might change a kingdom or be lost to the rain. What other stories, sealed in wax and ink, slipped through the cracks of history, unread? The invisible architects, how medieval bureaucrats held kingdoms together. Section 1, Parchment and Patience. Inside the medieval chancery, in the grand halls of medieval castles and the quieter rooms of cloisters and town halls, a lesser-known class of workers labored behind the scenes to make kingdoms function. These were the clerks, secretaries, and scribes, the invisible architects of governance. While kings and lords fought battles and claimed titles, it was the bureaucrats who kept track of land grants, tax rolls, court records, and treaties. Their tools were not swords or spears, but parchment, ink, and a detailed knowledge of Latin and legal precedent. The heart of this system was the chancery, a formal office attached to the royal court or a bishop's domain. In the chancery, Scribes produced and copied documents, issued royal charters, and preserved administrative records in orderly rolls and ledgers. These rooms were dusty and dim, filled with the scratch of quills and the smell of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. The process was tedious and exacting. Writing even a single charter could take hours, and documents often required multiple drafts. Scribes worked under pressure, sometimes in freezing conditions and occasionally under threat. Mistakes could have serious consequences. A misplaced line or altered word might invalidate a land grant or spark a legal dispute. Yet despite the tedium, this was work of immense importance. In an age without mass printing or standardized record-keeping, the chancery was the memory of the state. Bureaucrats kept track of who owed what to whom. From feudal obligations to harvest taxes, they recorded births and deaths of nobles, legal disputes, ecclesiastical appointments, and military service. If a question arose about a knight's claim to land or a town's right to hold a market, officials would consult the chancery rolls, often going back decades. The men who performed this work were often educated in cathedral schools or monasteries. Many were minor clergy, fluent in Latin and trained in canon law. Some rose through the ranks to become chancellors, advisors, or even bishops. Others remained anonymous, their handwriting the only trace they left in the corridors of history. So who were these silent organizers of power, and how did their work shape the flow of authority in a world ruled by kings but held together by parchment? Quills of power. The rise of record-keeping and administrative might. As medieval kingdoms grew more complex, so did the bureaucracy that sustained them. A king might command thousands of soldiers, oversee dozens of castles, and collect taxes from a patchwork of towns and villages, but none of it could function without careful record-keeping. It was the men with inkwells, not swords, who turned royal intentions into enforceable law. The chancery was the hub of this quiet power. There, clerks drafted documents with precise language that reflected not just a monarch's will, but also evolving legal norms and customs. Over time, these texts became increasingly standardized. Certain phrases appeared again and again, forming the backbone of legal and political communication. Given under our hand and seal, know ye that, and let it be done, were not mere formalities. They were the language of authority. Charters granted privileges to towns, monasteries, and individuals. Letters patent confirmed noble titles. Writs summoned people to court or instructed sheriffs. All of it passed through the hands of anonymous scribes who understood both the law and the king's intent. Importantly, many of these documents were copied and stored in register rolls or pipe rolls, large bound volumes that served as the central archive. England's Chancery, for example, kept meticulous financial records known as the pipe rolls starting in the 12th century, volumes that remain valuable to historians today. These rolls allowed the crown to track debts, fines, and rents across the kingdom. It was data in its earliest form, but it wasn't just monarchs who relied on bureaucracy. Large ecclesiastical bodies, such as the papal curia, operated their own intricate chancery systems, complete with scribes, notaries, and archivists. Letters flowed between bishoprics and abbeys, resolving disputes over land and doctrine. The process might seem glacial to us now. Messages could take weeks to arrive, and responses might take months, but this system enabled a fragile kind of continuity in an unstable world. With time, bureaucrats began to accumulate real influence. A clever clerk could shape the interpretation of a royal decree with a well-placed clause or ambiguous phrase. Some even became power brokers in their own right, valued for their memory, legal acumen, and discretion. But how did these anonymous architects of order keep control in an age of feuding barons, illiterate nobles, and shifting allegiances? And what happened when their quiet, ink-stained power clashed with the brute force of the sword? Between the sword and the seal, bureaucracy's quiet battle for authority. By the late Middle Ages, the quiet world of the Chancery was no longer merely a background operation. As kingdoms expanded and governments matured, bureaucrats found themselves navigating a delicate balance between royal authority, feudal power, and their own administrative discretion. They were, in effect, the referees in an increasingly complex game of politics. This was never more evident than during disputes over land, succession, or taxation. Nobles often arrived at court, brandishing crumbling charters, demanding that old promises be honored. Clerks would pore over records, verifying seals and script, determining whether a claim was valid or fabricated. Sometimes, a bureaucrat's refusal to authenticate a document could spark conflict. These men, armed only with parchment, occasionally stood in the way of lords and even kings. In England, during the reign of Edward I, royal clerks helped standardize legal writs and expanded the system of common law, a momentous development that centralized judicial power and reduced the chaos of feudal courts. In France, the growing number of trained notaries and legal scribes allowed the crown to exert firmer control over once autonomous regions. Bureaucrats didn't just react to royal whims. They shaped them. Some became indispensable advisors. Others, like Thomas Becket, before his fallout with Henry II, began as chancellors managing paperwork and rose to positions of immense political weight. The blending of church and state roles gave these officials access to both spiritual and secular authority. But this came with risks. Clerks were occasionally accused of corruption or favoritism. A well-placed bribe or vague phrasing could mean the difference between a monastery's prosperity and ruin. Still, the majority of bureaucrats simply labored on, day after day, year after year, recording the transactions of a society that could not run without them. Today, the legacy of these medieval administrators lives on in court systems, land registries, and the very notion of governmental record-keeping. Their daily routines, tedious, repetitive, but essential, laid the groundwork for modern civil service. So the next time you receive a government form or wait in line at a registry office, remember the medieval scribes hunched over a dim desk, quill in hand, quietly shaping a kingdom with every stroke. And ask yourself, how many empires have endured, not because of conquest, but because someone remembered to write things down? The bread book. How medieval bakers fed cities and dodged blame crumbs and counts. The regulations that ruled a loaf in the bustling towns of medieval Europe. Bread wasn't just food. It was infrastructure. Grain was the backbone of the medieval diet, and bread the daily staple for peasants and nobles alike. But for something so basic, the humble loaf was the center of constant supervision, suspicion, and subtle sabotage. At the heart of this quiet drama stood the baker, a tradesperson whose craft required not only skill but survival-level diplomacy. In a world before supermarkets and industrial farming, bread making was both art and liability. Cities and towns across Europe passed detailed laws regulating how much a loaf should weigh, how it should be priced, and even what it should contain. One of the most enduring examples of this system was England's Assize of Bread and Ale, first issued in the 13th century. This wasn't a vague guideline. It was a complex, legally binding document that told bakers exactly how much bread they should provide for a given amount of money, depending on the fluctuating price of wheat. Town officials would regularly weigh loaves, and punishments for shortchanging customers could be severe: fines, public shaming, or in repeat cases, the baker's oven could be destroyed. That wasn't metaphorical. There were records of magistrates ordering brick ovens dismantled if bakers cheated the public. This scrutiny might seem excessive, but bread was a lifeline. Most city dwellers ate it daily, and many spent over half their wages on it. If loaves got lighter or more expensive, it could cause unrest, or even riots. And riots did happen, often in Paris, Florence, and London. Grain shortages or price spikes sometimes led to chaos in the streets, with bakers caught in the middle. To shield themselves, many bakers adopted a cautious custom. When selling a dozen loaves, they would quietly add a 13th. This baker's dozen wasn't generosity. It was a form of self-defense. Little extra ensured they wouldn't be accused of shorting a customer and dragged before a court. Behind the warmth of fresh bread lay a cold bureaucracy of weights, measures, fines, and enforcement. But who made the rules, and what happened when a baker followed the law, but the flour was bad, or the oven cracked, or the city turned on its own? Of mills and middlemen, the hidden perils behind every loaf for the medieval baker. Flour was everything, and getting good flour was a daily gamble. Unlike modern systems where flour is processed and standardized, medieval bakers relied on local millers who ground grain using stone mills powered by water, or less often, wind. But this essential step in the bread-making chain was fraught with risk. Mills were notorious for inconsistencies. Rainy seasons could swell rivers and damage water wheels. Droughts stopped production altogether. Stones dulled, ground unevenly, or even broke, leaving tiny flakes of grit in the flour. Bakers had to adapt, often receiving batches of flour that varied in texture, moisture, and quality from day to day, and yet they were still legally bound to deliver loaves of a precise weight, appearance, and volume. If the flour was bad, the bread was bad, and the blame fell squarely on the baker, not the miller. Flour adulteration was another problem. Unscrupulous suppliers might mix good flour with powdered beans, chalk, or even ground bones to bulk it out. Bakers were expected to detect and reject such flour, but mistakes could slip through and the penalties were steep. A bad batch of bread could lead to rumors of poison, accusations of fraud, or worse, mob anger. To defend themselves, bakers kept meticulous records. Some cities even required bakers to enroll in guilds, where standards could be enforced collectively. The guild acted as a buffer, setting uniform prices, sharing knowledge, and offering a limited form of insurance against public wrath. Still, many bakers walked a fine line between obedience and improvisation. Some substituted ingredients in secret: mashed peas, rye, or barley, to stretch a scarce wheat supply. Others tinkered with fermentation, water temperature, or bake time to produce acceptable loaves from questionable inputs. And all the while, the city watched. Inspectors, called bread weighers or ale tasters in some towns, wandered through markets and back alleys unannounced, checking the weight and quality of loaves. The baker's world was thus one of calculation and compromise, making the best loaf possible under often impossible conditions. But what happened when the system failed? When the grain harvest collapsed or the millers raised prices, could the baker survive the blame? When the loaf collapsed, bread riots, blame, and quiet resilience. The most dangerous moment in a medieval baker's career wasn't an oven fire or a poor harvest. It was a hungry city in panic. When grain ran low or prices spiked, bakers became the public face of a complex economic failure they couldn't control. The blame came quickly and sometimes violently. Crowds turned on bakeries, looting stores or destroying ovens. In Florence in the 14th century, chroniclers recorded how citizens stormed bakeries during shortages, accusing the bakers of hoarding flour or colluding with corrupt officials. In London, records show that during famine years, city watchmen were assigned specifically to guard bakers' shops. The dear public needed bread. If it wasn't there, someone had to answer. And yet, despite the chaos and vulnerability, bakers continued to work. They adapted in small, invisible ways. They woke before dawn, kneaded in silence, and rationed their ingredients with near military discipline. Many slept beside their ovens, tending slow fires through the night to ensure loaves were ready by morning. In times of emergency, guilds and city councils sometimes stepped in. Bakers were given quotas of flour from city reserves or assigned fixed customers. Large institutions like monasteries or hospitals that still needed bread, even if no one else could afford it. Some cities even produced emergency loaves. Thinner, rougher bread sold at cost or given away by churches, but those moments only highlighted how fragile the system truly was. Bread was food, but it was also a symbol. It stood for fairness, for daily rhythm, for order. When the baker's table was empty, it meant something larger was broken. Today, in quiet museum collections and city archives, you can still find bread books, leather-bound, ledgers kept by medieval bakeries or town councils. They are filled with neat columns and annotations in Latin or early vernacular, lists of flour delivered, weights recorded, fines paid, inspections passed. These books tell a different kind of history, not of kings or conquests, but of steady hands and fire-tended nights. And they leave us with a simple truth. History was built on things that had to be made every day without fail. So the next time you eat bread, think not just of the farmer or the field, but of the baker who weighed the flour twice, added one extra roll for safety, and hoped that no one would come knocking with a scale. The eternal toll booth. How medieval bridges paid for themselves. Section 1. Stone, sweat, and silver. The quiet economics of crossing a river. To cross a river today, you might drive over a concrete span without thinking twice. In the Middle Ages, though, a bridge was a marvel, both an engineering feat and an economic engine. Behind each arch of stone and timber stood a complex web of labor, financing, and rules. And always, there was a toll. At first glance, a medieval bridge seemed simple. A path from one bank to another. But in reality, it was a rare and valuable piece of infrastructure. Building one required massive coordination. Stone cutters to shape the piers, carpenters to frame the scaffolds, masons to lay mortar by hand. Sometimes construction took decades. The old London Bridge, for instance, was begun in 1176 and wasn't completed until 1209. What's more, bridges were expensive to maintain. Stone cracked in the frost, timber rotted in the rain, floods swept away foundations, and armies sometimes burned crossings to slow an enemy. Tolls were one solution, a way to fund both the construction and the ongoing upkeep. Travelers who crossed the bridge might pay in coins, goods, or even services. In some towns, local peasants owed a small yearly fee just for the right to use the crossing during market days. At certain times, especially in France or the Low Countries, tolls varied depending on what you carried. Grain, wine, salt, or wool each had different rates. Toll keepers, often stationed in small huts or towers, recorded the crossings in ledgers, handing out tokens or chits as receipts. But the question was, who collected the toll? Sometimes it was a monastery, especially if the monks had paid for the bridge's construction. Other times, a local lord or even the king's treasury claimed the right. There were even cases of private individuals, wealthy merchants or landowners, financing a bridge in exchange for exclusive toll rights for a set number of years. Over time, the right to collect tolls became something akin to property. It could be inherited, sold, or transferred through marriage. In this way, a single stone bridge might quietly support a minor noble family for generations. But what happened when the bridge collapsed, or when the tolls became a burden the locals refused to bear? And who made sure the money collected at the crossing was actually spent maintaining the bridge and not funding a private estate? Broken arches and broken trust. When the system faltered, a medieval bridge could endure for centuries, but not without constant care, and when that care slipped, the results were swift and dangerous. In towns across Europe, neglected bridges collapsed under the weight of carts, animals, and pilgrims. Flooding was especially cruel. Rivers like the Rhone, the Thames, and the Danube were unpredictable, and a single surge could undermine foundations that had taken decades to lay. In such moments, the blame came fast. Travelers stranded on the banks cursed the toll keepers. Townspeople wondered where the toll money had gone. Local councils, when they existed, scrambled to find old contracts, attempting to pin responsibility on someone. Anyone. Often the real answer was simple. The funds had dried up, been mismanaged, or quietly diverted. This was not just an inconvenience, it was an economic crisis. Bridges connected more than banks. They connected regions, markets, and trade routes. A collapsed bridge could isolate an entire town, sending merchants on costly detours or halting grain shipments entirely. In some cases, rival towns deliberately let bridges rot, hoping to redirect commerce through their own gates. To restore a bridge, communities turned to all manner of fundraising. Churches organized almsgiving campaigns and granted indulgences to those who donated to rebuilding efforts. Monarchs might authorize special market days, with a cut of the proceeds going toward repairs. Wealthy merchants or guilds sometimes stepped in, funding restorations in exchange for control over future tolls, or more subtly, to gain favor with the ruling elite. But such interventions came at a cost. Control of a bridge often meant control of movement. Those who owned toll rights could refuse passage, increase fees, or grant waivers to friends and allies. Some travelers tried to bypass toll bridges altogether, using fords or makeshift ferries nearby. This led to a quiet war of toll evasion and enforcement. In France, Some bridge-owning abbeys hired armed guards to prevent illicit crossings. In England, toll evaders might be fined or even imprisoned for dodging the king's fee, and yet even in this world of fines and tolls, bridges held symbolic power. They were seen as acts of mercy, acts of union. In religious thought, the bridge was often a metaphor, a narrow path from sin to salvation. When bridges broke, it wasn't just a logistical failure. It was seen as a breach of duty, even a moral collapse. So who ensured these ancient crossings endured? And what sort of people made their lives maintaining a structure most only walked across? The keepers of the crossing, quiet custodians of stone and wood. To build a bridge took a generation. To maintain one took a lifetime. And so, scattered across medieval Europe, a quiet class of workers emerged, uncelebrated, often anonymous, yet essential. The bridge wardens. They weren't priests or knights or scholars. They were craftsmen, masons, toll keepers, and caretakers whose job was to ensure that travelers could cross the river day after day, year after year. In some towns, the role was formalized. Bridge wardens were appointed by guilds or councils, responsible not only for toll collection but also for inspecting the stonework, cleaning debris, and reporting damage. Their ledgers, when preserved, read like technical journals. Lists of lime quantities, timber purchases, rivet counts, and repair intervals. A failing arch wasn't just a crack in the bridge. It was a deadline. In other cases, monks served as stewards. At Pont Saint-Benazet in Avignon, the famous bridge built in the 12th century, a chapel stood mid-span, both a spiritual sanctuary and a symbol of ecclesiastical stewardship. There, religious orders collected tolls but also prayed for safe crossings, merging sacred duty with civic responsibility. Bridge chapels were not uncommon. Many medieval bridges featured small shrines or altars, often placed at the midpoint. Travelers would stop to give thanks or seek protection for the journey ahead. These structures blended the practical with the spiritual, just like the bridge itself. Interestingly, not all bridges charged tolls forever. In some cases, once the original cost of construction had been repaid, tolls were reduced or abolished, but such generosity was rare. More often, the toll became a permanent fixture long after the initial debt was settled. It evolved into a form of taxation, a quiet stream of income for whoever controlled it. And yet, despite their strategic and financial importance, few medieval bridges have left their builders' names behind. The arches remain. The ledgers survive in archives, but the men and women who tended the crossings, patched the mortar, and risked their lives in floods are mostly forgotten. Their legacy is not in grand monuments, but in continuity, in the daily act of making sure others could pass through. Next time you cross a bridge, stone or steel, pause for a moment. Imagine the generations who kept that path open, sometimes with little more than a hammer, a bucket of lime, and an old ledger tracking every toll. They were the custodians of connection, the unsung stewards of stone.